So yesterday, here in Oxford, you elected your new Chancellor, and it's never a clean and simple business to decide who should lead an academic institution, especially one that is constitutionally designed not to be led. It always helps if candidates know how to canvass behind the scenes, so we may colour ourselves shocked that a politician has swept into power here. In a similar vein, a little over 70 years ago, C.P. Snow wrote a book often described as the best academic novel in English, all about the murky and Machiavellian politicking that goes on when electing new heads of house in Oxbridge colleges. That 1951 book, The Masters, includes a revealing scene with which I would like to begin. Elliot Lewis, the central character and then a young research fellow, asks the college's senior fellow, Maurice Gay, an emeritus professor of Icelandic, the following: "Do you want a scientist as master?" Without a beat, Gay rebuffs so crude a question. "I have never attached any importance to boundary lines between branches of learning. A man can do distinguished work in any, and we ought to have outgrown these arts and science controversies before we leave the school debating society." Shocked at so stark a response, Lewis says to himself, "I had been snubbed, and very reasonably snubbed." Well, Lewis is in fact the semi-autobiographical character that reflects Snow's own experience as a research fellow in physics at Christ's College, Cambridge, when he participated in the election of Sir Charles Galton Darwin, grandson of Darwin proper, to the mastership of 1937. That contest is staged in the Masters as between Thomas Crawford, a biologist modelled on C.G. Darwin, and Paul Jago, an English scholar cloaking the real theologian Canon Charles Raven, who narrowly lost out. Both in the book and in reality, the fellowship weigh up the scholarly standing, the publication profile, the personal politics, the people skills, and all manner of adjunct factors as they campaign with increased zeal and bitterness for their preferred candidates. Now, the book had always struck me as a clever and revealing satire of how a cloistered, closeted college can lose its sense of self amid the internecine squabbles within its walls. But when I myself was a research fellow, also at Christ's, a slim diary was found stuffed behind a radiator in the library. It was the diary of one of Snow's colleagues at Christ's, the classicist and fellow librarian Arthur Peck. And what was remarkable about this document was not just that it recorded in great detail the manoeuvrings of that 1937 election, but that it provided a key to work out all of the real figures behind Snow's fictional characters. And what was striking to me, then as now, was that far from Snow being someone stepped back and separated from the campaign at a disapproving distance, Snow himself was a major campaigner, a mover and shaker, wheeler-dealer, even changing his own support very controversially late in the day. Thus, Lewis Eliot's childishly pitting the arts and sciences against one another was in fact in the voice of Snow himself. This is the same C.P. Snow who, at the end of that decade, in 1959, made his most famous public contribution via his Reed lectures delivered at Cambridge that year. His analysis of the so-called two cultures came to be one of the most cited tropes of the 20th century. Snow argued that scientists had become intellectually impoverished by regarding the humanities as of no relevance to them. In turn, he lamented that the scholars of the humanities had little to no interest in the workings of the physical world or in keeping up with rapid advances in scientific understanding. And as he tartly quipped, the majority of the cleverest people in the Western world have about as much insight into modern physics as their Neolithic ancestors would have had. So Snow expressed his disappointment and frustration that these two divergent intellectual cultures simply could not talk to each other. As he said, they could only make faces. In addition, he railed against over-specialism, philistinism, and intellectual snobbery of all kinds. As a scientist and novelist, Snow naturally regarded himself as a privileged observer with a foot in both camps. and that self-assurance certainly put him in the firing line of many former Cambridge colleagues. One thinks in particular of F.R. Leavis, whose wild counterblast of 1962 is a timeless academic specimen of raw, red-misted rage. Now, in the wake of Snow's lecture, circumstances did improve for a while. In the 1960s and the 1970s, the average person's knowledge of science increased, while the humanities still did flow in the waters of our educational institutions and public culture. But the dawn of the digital age posed new challenges, and Snow's longed-for reunification of the two cultures did not come to pass. Today, 65 years later, in 2024, the situation has deteriorated on several fronts. Many of us here will share Snow's worries about the shortcomings and short-sightedness of our divided intellectual world. If anything, there is now an even greater disconnect between the arts and humanities on the one hand and science and tech on the other. What is more, there aren't just two, but at least four cultures, if we include those who see academia primarily as a means for socio-political activism, and also those who have given up entirely on the idea that education should be the intellectual leader of our society, higher education, that is. Many people, and perhaps most of you in this hall, do seek to return to the essence of what a university was about. After all, its very name doesn't mean, as is often thought, a universality of subjects studied, and there are many subjects that have never been studied in universities. Rather, the term signifies oneness, the essential unity of those involved in our shared intellectual project of garnering knowledge about the world we find ourselves in. And that should unite all of us. As Sir Francis Bacon so elegantly put it, surely as nature createth brotherhood in families, so in like manner there cannot but be fraternity in learning. Well, I'm here this evening not just to make the case for the central importance of the humanities in both the university and society at large, but also to set out a more positive vision for how we can recover and restore them to the central place they should have in all of our lives. My challenge is to make a case for the humanities which, in order to find support from each and every one of you, does not require prior agreement on issues or principles that often make the difference. On your area of academic training, on your political disposition, on your religious beliefs, should you have any, on your age or stage of career, or indeed on any aspect of identity writ large. I instead want my claims to apply equally to everyone here, not by virtue of your being here, but by virtue of your being human. Okay, like all the most boring school essays, I must begin with a definition. What do I mean by the term humanities? I don't include the social sciences, or indeed the wider range of subjects historically placed under that confusing umbrella of liberal arts. I mean instead the study of humans' creative output of languages and literatures, the arts, philosophy, theology, and the writings of history. At root, the humanities seek to understand what other humans across space and time have produced, individually and collectively, and to learn from them more about what it is to be human. The humanities thus open up the accumulated wealth of literature, art, and culture to allow for profound exploration of the inescapable questions about what is good or bad, what is beautiful or ugly, worthwhile and salutary, or pointless and destructive. In particular, the great works of literature, novels, histories, poetry, plays, shine as pools of light amid the relative darkness. They allow us to glimpse universal truths as well as encounter the diversity of humankind in all its fascinating particularities. And it's telling, is it not, that the discipline I am here to defend is called the Humanities. We're all aware that the singular of that term, humanity, not only means humankind, but also expresses the quality of empathy or kindness, of being humane. It may then seem strange or even arrogant that its plural can denote an academic field. But it actually is my contention that the humanities, through being collective expressions of our shared human reality, do indeed encapsulate myriad elements of the human condition and thus afford myriad opportunities for sympathy, empathy, and deeper understanding. But we can never take the humanities for granted. We should remember that they have not always been the core business of our universities. At the dawn of these institutions 1,000 years ago, philosophy was joined by dialectic, that is logic, and mathematics in pride of place. But these skills were ultimately in the service of theology, law, or medicine. Literature and art had very little clout indeed. It wasn't until the 14th century and the Italian Renaissance that the humanities enjoyed a genuine rebirth of their classical character. This moment saw a concerted turn back to the principles of Latin humanitas, and thus a genuine resetting of the educational mission. Some 21 centuries ago, Cicero coined the term studia humanitatis, the pursuits of humanity, to describe the intellectual domain of humans. For him, humanitas meant the human condition, but it evolved to describe both humane conduct and a liberal education. For the Renaissance humanists, as they styled themselves, education was similarly conceived as liberatory to the individual. For that pioneering figure of Petrarch, Francesco Petrarca, the traditional disciplines of metaphysics and logic could indeed help us understand virtue, but only literature, poetry, and art could spur us to enact virtue. Thus, the life well lived needs to be grounded and fueled by literature. Although the Renaissance is often said to have marked a new dawn in the understanding of the human self, crucially, Renaissance man was not an island. He was externally facing, both civic-focused in his activities and open-ended in his ambitions. As a final historical point, for us here in England, the humanities did not materially impinge upon our ancient universities until the age of Henry VIII in the early 16th century, when so-called readers in humanity, that is Latin, started to crop up. Half a millennium later, today, some of those vestiges remain, and as a classicist, if I were based here, I would be teaching literae humaniores, the so-called more humane literature, however dubious that claim. But alas, in our present age, humanities departments are not enjoying an enlightened era. Student enrollment is declining appreciably. In America, numbers have literally fallen off a cliff. In the UK, over the last 15 years, humanities enrollments have declined by 20%, while the university sector has grown by 20%. And this sad phenomenon can be witnessed actually across the world's universities, even outside the Anglosphere. There's no sign that a reversal lies around the corner. Therefore, if we seriously want to preserve our humanities, we need to step back and think what to do. Now, I just want to be clear on one point at this instance. I don't believe that there has been a fall of interest among people in the humanities. That's good news, but clearly there's been a decline in wanting to pursue the current university experience of a humanities degree. Alongside this stark decline in student numbers, there's a concomitant decline in investment. There is, in many respects, a decline in standards. And from the public perspective, there is a sharp decline in the trust and societal value that the humanities enjoy. Wherever you want to place the blame for recent closures of humanities departments, it nevertheless serves as grim proof that as things stand, the field is in poor health. All of us, I'm sure, have views on this problem. For my part, I identify the encroachment of certain factors, of bureaucracy, of students as consumer thinking, of politics, of social activism, and of a collective lack of confidence in the intellectual mission. Some academics, in my mind, have had a direct hand in this decline, especially a group that I call the ladder pullers, those who enjoyed a wide-ranging education and deep immersion in the canon themselves, but who have since become bored by that and disenchanted by its undeniable historic dominance. So they find reasons not to teach such core material to the young, who have never encountered it, and instead direct them into more fringe material that, however interesting, simply cannot be understood without the fundamental grounding of the canon. This behaviour is simply unforgivable. It was a major mistake for humanities departments to allow themselves to be administered and appraised as per the scientific model, one which funds collaborative research where successful progress and effects upon society can be quantified and appraised. A system that worked in the sciences and made some sense in the social sciences was dragged and dropped into the humanities without any serious thought about its suitability or its hidden dangers. The result has seen departments scramble desperately after fleeting fads, such as relevance, political salience, and so-called impact, all the while dancing to the tune of box-ticking bureaucracies. Yet there is a more material failing of the humanities in our age. Their genuinely universal power has been constrained by the myopic and misguided desire to tie literature, art, and even history to the supposedly uniform experiences of certain identity groups. This problem pervades our educational system. This very month, we have witnessed pedagogical experts advocate for the removal of Shakespeare and Dickens from our school curricula. All the while, there is the constant restriction of both the syllabus and of secondary scholarship to more recent times. The canon is real, and it exists for hard-won reasons, whatever its flaws, and to ignore that fact is neither kind nor progressive. It is harmful, and it is, in fact, exclusionary. It's important for me to be clear at this point where my objections lie, because they are more complex than this sort of tub-thumping rhetoric might suggest. Personal experience. Historically, the academic study of the humanities can be considered as operating on its own upper stratum, that of rigorous, evidence-based criticism and scholarship, built upon the notion that progress can be made in exploring and understanding the corpus of material that makes up the humanities. Crucially, this stratum was elevated above and was distinct from the personal and subjective enrichment that this corpus brought each student and scholar. This separation is essential for an academic program to retain its integrity, of teaching a syllabus, examining it fairly, and giving weight and meaning to the degree awarded. Yet the contemporary decline of the humanities has been hastened by the loss of distinction between these two strata. Many academics have made plenty of fuss about lived experience, which is something often scoffed at. And there are indeed three reasons to object. First, it's a clumsy way of talking about personal experience, the idea of non-lived being an absurdity. Second, the concept necessarily introduces the subjective, something that is fundamentally unmeasurable and untestable, into academic scenarios which should be seeking the utmost objectivity possible and probing falsifiable claims. Third, it opens the door to the kind of identity politics where certain subjective stances are awarded greater evidential or even moral standing than others. And in the research and the teaching and the examining of the humanities, I put it to you that that should have no place. But all that said, the personal rather than academic value of the humanities necessarily does lie in each individual's subjective experience. The transformative power they possess is manifested only in that experience, where and how the reality of each of us exists. Human beings cannot but be in the moment. It's literally in the name that we have. Our essence exists in experience, internal and external, and that sounds like a banal truism, but I think it is a profound truth. We humans are all radically different and radically the same. We're all afflicted by the challenges of the human condition and life alongside one another. Our humanitas consists of our shared hopes and passions, our weaknesses and uncertainties. We are all driven by our need for mutual recognition. But however much our species differs, we all partake in the universal desire to live a good life. The humanities afford the space outside our daily interactions to reflect on what that should and could mean for each of us. and that experience is of paramount importance to a happy life. So whether from a short-sighted and misguided attempt to increase student numbers, or to shore up student satisfaction, or to destabilize the established order of academic culture, or to role-play as societal change-makers, certain aspects of our personal experience of the humanities, how they make us feel, good or bad, whether we see our identity prosper or flounder in the material, has been elevated up into the academic discipline. And this is a perversion of the purpose and principles of a university. So I suggest that we are faced with a two-sided problem. The scholarly project of humanistic inquiry has been destabilized by the introduction of the subjective and the untestable, obstructing or even ousting the established practices of the field. The recent trend of tying academic appointments in the humanities with DEI statements about a candidate's socio-political beliefs is the most stark and damaging instance of how the way has been lost. In turn, any defense of the fundamental power of the humanities to enrich any and every individual has fallen eerily silent. The universal appeal of the humanities really is universal and is not to be short-circuited by personal identity or political posturing. Meanwhile, those academics who see the problem have failed to make a loud and clear case to arrest the decline. It is as if they are held back by a crisis of confidence, beset by a real uncertainty about what their main purpose now is. Is it to teach the humanities? Is it to advance research in them? Is it to widen participation in the department? Is it to enact social justice outside the department? And while some are scrabbling to defend them, many others are in the wings moving to defund them. For most of the history of Western education, the humanities have not needed defending. An explicit case for the humanities was not made to the public before the mid-20th century. Because they were out there in the world, they were known, and they were, for the most part, loved. Higher-level scholarship in the universities thus worked against a secure backdrop and within a supportive community that valued the humanities unquestioningly. That fundamental rooting of the academic discipline to a broader culture that valued them has now become unstuck. These disciplines are cast adrift, bobbing aimlessly on a sea of uncertainty. So, a fair question: if I love the humanities so much, why earlier this year, as Dan said, did I resign from my permanent post at Cambridge? It's a question I've been asked hundreds of times. There are many problems I could set out. I won't in detail, you'll be pleased to know, especially about decline in rigour and in seriousness. But the most important point, which is really hard to summarise unless I have the time such as this, is that I felt that that lower substrate I mentioned had given way, that the very foundation on which the whole enterprise stood was collapsing. As a textual critic, I work on restoring the texts of classical literature. My job is to seek out where errors have occurred in the stages of copying a text and aiming to restore, as far as is possible, the author's original version. The obvious goal is to return as close as possible to the literature as it was written. But ultimately, why do we want to recover that? Is it to have more data about the classical world so that we can know more about how the ancients thought and acted? Or is it to be able to appreciate the work of literature on its own terms? Either way, the deeper answer needs to be acknowledged that through direct exposure to the works of other human intellects, we are enriched. Now, although my focus falls squarely on the humanities this evening, I won't restrict my remarks to those whose lives are spent in that field, because what I say, in my own mind at least, really does apply to everyone. So I'd like to make a few remarks, if you will allow me, about science and technology. Now, although I am a romantic about many things in life, I am no Luddite, no loather of tech. I am a realist and a pragmatist about the world in which we find ourselves. and I temper my skepticism of tech utopianism with that reality. But let us begin with science. That very term is a little misleading, since Latin scientia, which gives us the word, simply means knowledge. But modern science doesn't concern all that we know. It has been radically delimited to knowledge about the natural order of the universe in which we live, and what little knowledge of humans it tackles is limited to our biological, chemical, and neurological processes. Despite being avowedly universal and apparently all-encompassing, science is fundamentally narrow. Its realm is what can be quantified, measured, and tested. Science can only be concerned with what science can validate. It needs numerical data, and it needs processes whose outcomes are testable and replicable. Yes, this objective reality is immensely important, but whether we like it or not, the human lives we live are largely conducted in ways that are not measurable or finite or discrete. They're finite in the sense we die, I take that point. You can't give a number and value to how we hope or love or laugh or grieve, how our spirits thrill at music, or how we empathize, even beyond words, with those who suffer. As for the spiritual or transcendent aspects that many of us place at the center of our lives, they may as well not exist. Computer says no. Now, this isn't the time to castigate the Enlightenment for its myopia and naivety, nor to laugh at the absurdities of the First French Republic, but it's enough to observe that science does not and can never broach the essential experience of being human. Conversely, science requires the humanities to give it direction and meaning. It cannot determine human values on its own terms and needs to operate within moral and ethical parameters. Only that lets us judge whether so-called scientific progress is good or bad. If we take a step back, as Snow would at this point, the humanities and the sciences are species of the same genus. They are both responses to the universe in which we find ourselves. Yet only the latter, only the sciences, claim to be in control and to have the answers. The former, the humanities, open up new questions but close none. Almost all products of the humanities over history have been produced by people who believe in something transcendent, whether religious or not. The greatest works of literature and philosophy do not give answers. They are ambiguous, awkward, profound, and the scientific method has nothing it can do with or for them. I turn now to technology, the tools that are meant to liberate people from toil. Ever since the invention of fire, humans have found ways to alleviate the travails of daily life. And over the last 6 centuries, technology's progress has been greater than the entirety of human history combined. The printing press, the steam engine, the telephone, the light bulb, the aeroplane, the space rocket, the internet, the smartphone, AI, and on. Well, the futurist utopians continue to assert that with just a little more technological progress, humans can finally break free from their labors and be released from their pains. But history tells a very different story. Just as the machines of the industrial age ended up increasing human working hours, so has modern technology eroded our time to live freely. Consider the advent of email, which some of you will be old enough to remember actually arriving rather than being around us as if by magic. Well, at that moment, what a wonder it was to send a message instantly to anyone, anywhere in the world. What efficiency it will bring, and what time it will free up. What nonsense. This form of communication has only filled our days with more work and has so often intruded into our evenings and weekends, erasing not just the time it theoretically saved, but taking the time that was once free from work when a letter or call could only reach you at your workplace. And the data show unequivocally how in the computer and internet age, working hours have increased steadily since the 1970s. Not just our time, but our relationships can suffer with technology. Despite its claims to build bridges, it also distances us from our world. Not just from nature, but from the very people we seek to connect with. So-called social media, which is now unrecognizably different from the clunky first phase of Facebook 20 years ago, has the ironic effect of making people less social when surrounded by other humans. It creates introspection and encourages isolation, all the while snuffing out the essential and incomparable spark of three-dimensional social interaction. It's no exaggeration to say that our brains, all of our brains, are simply not evolved enough to handle this technology. We are addicted to our phones, not just because of the conscious experience they offer, but because of their strategy of bombarding and rapidly rewarding our subconscious selves. It's no wonder that young people's, and indeed everyone's, attention spans have shortened. In an age of convenience and hyperactive screens, we need instant returns. Or we will move on to something else. All technology comes with hidden costs. And in the case of the smartphone, we face not just technology as liberator, but technology as captor. Rather tragically, our phones have become the repository of much of our daily experience. We stare silently into these little screens and engage with them rather than those around us. I am as guilty of this as anyone. Convenience is king, and if I can read the news and literature and listen to what I want, where I want, whenever I want, then it's going to take a good reason to stop me. But stop I should. Now, why, you may fairly wonder, you may even leave, am I several minutes deep into a tangent about handheld technology when making a case for reviving the humanities? It is because, in my mind, the two are intimately linked. We have let the humanities be taken from us by letting our time and indeed the essential joys of human interaction be taken from us. Many young people now quite literally use phones as an extension of their human experiences. It's no longer odd, but entirely typical behavior for someone to experience a live audiovisual event, a music gig, say, a museum visit, whatever it may be, by watching it through their screens. If it's not a continuous video, it's the constant taking of and posing for photos. What exactly is going on here? The shallow analysis is that these people want to preserve the memory of the event so that they can enjoy it again in the future and not just in the moment. Slightly deeper is to regard this as a push for social capital. The videos and images are collected primarily to share with friends and strangers online in order to harvest admiration or envy from others and thus boost social status. But I fear that something even deeper is going on, that there is a subconscious fear to give oneself up to the immersive experience. The sheer intensity of being there in the moment and not on your own terms is disarming and can be overwhelming. This is precisely why the performing arts have always been so important, because they can reveal what total immersion in an art form can be and can do when the human experience of others draws you in. After all, entertainment is literally to draw someone out and into your own human space. So to help revivify the humanities, we need to find every means of encouraging young people to give themselves over to the arts. And what of our leisure time when we are not busied by busyness? How comfortable are we with our own freedom when we don't have anything to do? Do we still need entertaining? There seems to be something about the machine age, not just the digital era, that doesn't let our minds settle. We are unaccustomed to just being. For many, walking, reading, or even long-form thinking just isn't sufficiently exciting. Or rather, they haven't had the freedom or the incentive or the confidence to commit to these simple and rewarding activities for themselves. Those people who emerge wide-eyed from their digital detox retreats, happier than they have ever been, we tend to view as oddballs. But perhaps they are heralds of a freedom that lies so clearly within reach. All the while, we live in an era where loneliness is at an all-time high, and many face crises of meaning and purpose alone. Social media, then, doesn't pay out what it promises, but leaves us desensitized and, in several respects, dehumanized. Now, to be clear, however uncertain its goals and however deep-seated my worries, technological progress is real and often good, but that doesn't remove the humanities from view. Consider whether it's the futurist pining for a lifespan of many centuries or perhaps even immortality, or for living on a different planet or living in the company of some otherwise unknown alien life form, all of these goals are in fact question-begging, can-kicking outcomes. What does the happy life look like then or forever? In a similar vein, those who think that the better world would just arrive if only our social and political system were reformulated and at last done properly, still leave open and unanswered the fundamental question about what, under that nouveau regime, would make fulfilled and happy human lives. So I'll leave this here. Whatever your faith in the progress of science, whatever your trust in the gifts of technology, and whatever your personal political commitments, a hole will still need filling by the humanities. Before I return at last to what we must do for them, please allow me the last of my tangents on the latest of the technologies I listed, artificial intelligence. For if the 18th and the 19th centuries were the age of science and the 20th the age of technology, the 21st is surely the age of AI. Although neither artificial nor intelligent in the strict senses of those words, AI is a mind-bogglingly powerful tool. The large language models and generative pre-trained transformers of our day are able not just to recognize patterns, but also to create entirely new material. Having been trained on unimaginably chaotic and massive data dumps of human endeavors, contemporary AI is a remarkable force that can execute very easily and effectively instantly much of what humans are currently paid to do. And without wanting to sound too alarmist this coming Christmas, I believe that the greatest challenge of this century will not be a third world war, or climate change, or the mass migration of peoples, or a shortage of resources, even though all of those will unfortunately become greater problems. It will be the upheavals wrought by AI, however innocuous or utilitarian they seem. Fundamentally, the massive middle tier of our economy and society, i.e. the great majority of jobs that don't involve skilled manual work, human-to-human exchange, or very high-level professional autopsy and judgment, all of that is going to be heavily incentivized at downgrading the human workforce considerably. If the core aspects of the job, writing copy, answering queries, consulting reference material, processing data, running pattern recognition, etc., can be done literally 100 times faster, for almost zero cost, and without any of the HR friction and faff of having an actual human in an actual place, then productivity can be increased and profit massively increased. Beyond the core human staff required to prompt the AI and appraise its output, the only thing to hold back an owner from mass redundancies is his or her moral compass. And the history of business has a very poor track record on that score. It's no good pointing to the current mistakes, lack of nuance, biddability, arrogance, and biases of AI. It evolves faster than any criticism can keep up with. AI already can produce not just narrative and poetry, but also images and video. We're in the realm of the auto-generation of fiction, where a given reader's former history of reading allows the instant creation of novels tailored to that specific individual. Soon enough, TV and movies will be doing the same. And that may seem the perfect consumer outcome, but it also portends an awful future where culture is so tailored to each individual user that there is nothing communal we can talk and bond over through shared experience. Yet even these creative leaps of AI are fundamentally lacking in two ways. First, it requires external human prompting. It has no imagination, no inspiration, no initiative, and by definition, no ability to think outside its box. It is rudderless without the creative insight of a human guide, at least for now. Second, and much more importantly, AI is bounded by the sea of processable human data. To be clear, AI already has complete mastery of that sea, but just as I said with science, it only has access to text, image, and sound, i.e., to what can be reduced to numbers. None of the data that matter most to modeling human intelligence, emotion, ethics, ambition, can be inputted into its neural network. It is an unfocused, unfeeling system which cannot even explain how it reaches the answers it does. So to regard AI as a parallel form of human intelligence is to reject the ineffable richness and the irreducible richness of what it is to be human. But since the AI revolution is here, my rather bleak forecast about humans' employment prospects does prompt the urgent question: what will humans do? Three things may in fact energize the flailing and ailing humanities. First, as I say, human experience and judgment will be of essential importance, not just for guiding AI, but also for analysing the one thing it can't know about, the human condition. Second, since many university subjects, especially in STEM subjects, will be of far lesser vocational use in the world of AI doing those things themselves, students may look for something deeper and turn to the humanities once more. And third, could these dramatic upheavals somehow, if I'm optimistic for a moment, open up a new age of leisure, and thus a return to the immersive and unhurried practices of that drive creativity in the humanities. If we, living and breathing humans, become less useful to businesses of the future, could we spend more time interacting with our surroundings independent of the digital world? The economic problems of all of this are utterly mind-boggling and so frightening. But the changes in human behavior could catalyze a reversion to something much more healthy and much more natural, indeed much more human. So at last I return to the humanities on their own terms. When asked why they matter, we're conditioned to think about what they can do for us externally. As a child, perhaps you played the why game as a surefire way to frustrate your poor parents. If you wanted to delay doing a particular chore, you could stall by asking why, and a reason would of course be given sharply enough. Then you would ask why that was the case, and why again to whatever came back. And after a series of why, you would be faced with one of two certain outcomes. You were either told to shut up and do it just because I say so, or all involved would end up staring into the opaque abyss of the very meaning of life. And all of that over tidying up your Lego. Now, doubtless you here are all much too grown up to try this as an adult, but how do we think a hypothetical law student might respond to this line of questioning if we wandered over into Wadham Library and asked such a person, why are you reading that article? Because I need to. Why? Because it's important to my current essay. Why? Because I'll have to cite it to get the good mark I need. Why? Because I want to get a good degree. Why? Because I want a good job. Why? Because I want to have good social standing, and I also want to be well paid. Why? Because I want to buy a house and a car. Why? Because I want to attract and support a future partner, all right? Why? Because I probably want to have a family down the line. Why? Because, now, I apologize to all students here who will doubtless have very different and much more enlightened answers to these questions. But you see how it's possible with this line of thinking to move rapidly from the niche act of reading an abstruse article on 17th century law right down to the fundamental question of why you want your life to be spent with a family of your own creation. This is where instrumental thinking always takes you, and it can look crude or indeed absurd when exposed to daylight. Yet there's an important fork in the road in these questions. The alternative turn can be made at the very first question, about why we undertake any intellectual activity. It is that we do so because it is interesting and because we enjoy it. As I approach 40, this has become my overriding response to the humanities, the unavoidable phenomenon of engaging with the history of human civilizations and the product of the human mind, is that such an experience is intellectually enriching, rewarding, and addictive. Now, of course, that privileged stance of enjoyment for its own sake is not going to cut it. It can't survive alone. There are myriad adjunct benefits to studying the humanities, primarily understanding the character and evolution of the cultures that surround us. All the hundreds of transferable skills one could list are real, but they are not the primary goal. Yes, the humanities cultivate critical and creative activity. Yes, literacy expands language and indeed thought. Yes, a robust humanities degree should make you a desirable employee. Yet, as recent decades of institutional campaigning have shown, it just doesn't work to make a skills-based or goal-driven vocational case for the humanities, about how they'll train you up to be the best in the workforce. Something deeper and something higher needs to be summoned up for why they matter. So to close, I get at last to my target. What are we to do? And I have 5 things to share, which I sincerely hope will be expanded by your views once I come to the end of that list. First, our universities actually need to act as intellectual beacons. They need to approach the humanities afresh in a humanistic light, which means 2 things. There needs to be a renewal of rigor in academic culture, dedicated to increasing understanding of the subject. Institutions need to strive for the gold standard of what proper humanities scholarship looks like: serious, impartial, truth-seeking research. Yet all the while, there needs to be a willingness to acknowledge the transformative powers of the humanities for the individual, something which gives purpose to the otherwise unrooted practices of education as mere training and research as mere career advancement. Without that connection, it's only a matter of time before the process descends to instrumental or ideological ends. Students need us to preserve spaces that can escape the vocational and utilitarian mindset the world imposes upon us. My remarks may explain in brief why I have, as you heard, joined a new institution based in America called Ralston College. And its main appeal to me is that it is genuinely liberating and exciting to be able to start from scratch and to focus solely on the things that matter for a humanities institution. Students there learn ancient Greek from scratch in Greece through the spoken method, reading Homer, Plato, and the New Testament within weeks, before going on to explore major works of the Western tradition back in Savannah, Georgia. It's a very exciting project, and we're in the process of launching a parallel Latin stream, so do watch that space. Second, and much more importantly for society at large, reading is a revelatory practice, and in fact may be the most powerful cure to the problems I outline. As I've said, young people's attention spans, and indeed our own, have been ruined by technology. The reading of long-form text, or indeed listening to me, has declined massively in recent years. As a result, there is not currently the throughput of young readers to keep the humanities thriving at university, especially readers of works beyond the novel. To be clear, students certainly have not become less clever, but from my experience, which is limited to classics in Cambridge, I grant, they do generally know less. And that's by virtue of not having had the freedom to explore wherever long-form reading takes them. The response of many departments has been to meet the students where they are and reduce the amount of reading set. Some have even replaced text with audio-visual material. But for serious institutions, this has to stop, as these are the sorts of decisions that once made, they will never be allowed to reverse. If humanities departments do conclude that they can't make students read, then they need to confess that they have failed to be what they claim to be. This decline in reading extends to all ages. Half of British adults now don't read regularly, and a third, more alarmingly, describe themselves as lapsed readers. They've just stopped. Yet the public health of the humanities requires people to read, or indeed listen to audiobooks. I'm no purist, that's perfectly good, but to do so away from screens. What I advocate for is not original or complex, and you may indeed roll your eyes. But the wheel does not need reinventing. It just needs rolling out on trickier terrain. We have to recommit to taking the space and contents of the library seriously. We need a dedicated place for physical books, the best technology ever invented, to be shelved by subject. The serendipity of seeing on the shelf that which you could never have searched for yourself is one of the major moments of intellectual adventure, and for many it has literally been life-changing seeing a book alongside what you were searching for. These library spaces should not be filled with computer stations or communal areas or cafes. They obviously can exist elsewhere. Instead, they should be dedicated, as was, to slow, long-form reading. And perhaps some would even be digital-free spaces, free from the distraction of screens, where notes can only be made by hand. And we can reinstill that other ancient and world-changing technology, so crucially linked with memory, of writing. It is a strength, not a weakness, of the humanities that they require time and immersion. There is no shortcut, and until just a few generations ago, a distinction was drawn between being clever versus being learned. In fact, clever could be a dismissive term used of someone who had wit but was glib and shallow, whereas to be learned held weight because it was hard-won. It had to take time. It wasn't elitist, it was open to any reader, but to be learned commanded respect. Outside universities in our wider society, we should promote the book club, covering all topics, as one of the great community assets, stitching together people where the common culture is fracturing. These could be given a philanthropic boost by a new Carnegie. As you will know, that Scottish-American steel magnate spent 90% of his fortune building 2,500 libraries across the world over 50 years. 660 were built in the British Isles, but many have closed in recent decades. So it may be that book clubs have to meet in pubs for now, but it could be worse whilst the libraries are being rebuilt. Third of my five, and these last three are briefer. Language is the beating heart of the humanities, and language can only be loved properly by learning a second language. This achievement is truly liberatory because it allows you to step outside of your own tongue and see how it works, even see that it works. This is unquestionably one of the most powerful and important intellectual experiences in life. Which precise second language you learn doesn't matter much, although the more interesting the material it opens up for you, the better. Put plainly, we should mandate a second language in schools, where, over the last 20 years, the numbers taking French GCSE have fallen by 2/3, and the number taking German by 3/4 just in the last 2 decades. Most British pupils now take no foreign language after the age of 14. Of course, learning foreign languages is time-consuming and often difficult. Yet I had the great pleasure of spending this past summer with Ralston College in Italy, using spoken Latin as a route to teaching beginners through direct immersion. And it proved to be a great success, as one or two in the hall could attest. And it was one of the great intellectual adventures of my life. So I think the immersive method of teaching a foreign language through that language may be the future when our classroom times are so constrained. Fourth, while there is no rapid fix to secondary education, one simple rule would fundamentally improve our schools and attention spans. You know what's coming. It's simply removing phones from classrooms and ideally from the school day entirely. Any teacher who is settled into using phones as study tools or embracing their presence as the inevitable reality of modern life is guilty of a dereliction of duty. I applaud those few schools that have done something so countercultural and doubtless so unpopular as debarring these disruptive devices from the classroom. As I said earlier, I feel that that piece fits into the whole nexus of how the humanities will gain some real life once more. Fifth, finally, but most importantly, the public needs to be inspired and led by people who can explain why they deem some products of the human intellect more inspiring and enriching than others. As it is, our society is so culturally starved of the humanities as to be cut apart and aimlessly adrift. We no longer have a shared conduit for the near infinite material of humankind to be curated and communicated for our consideration. Education is failing to introduce younger generations to the power of the humanities. Politics has lost all conception of them. The news and media engage far less than they could and should. And as for what we call the publicly funded arts, they have for the most part retreated into predictable social commentary and political activism, leaving behind not just the humanities, but crucially, the general public. No happiness comes from wandering lost in the dark woods of relativism. You need only talk to those who espouse that position to see that. In the short to medium term, what we need is to improve things at scale, and the internet stands waiting for that challenge. The online popularity of deep, long-form discussion is genuinely stunning and heartening. Hopefully, it can somehow spur immersive reading as well away from our screens. To close, for my part, one of the happiest and most rewarding things I've done in the last 4 years has been to co-found a not-for-profit educational project called Antigone. I've poured thousands of hours into this online classics website, and I'm joined this evening by a couple of other tireless editors. Our conviction has been simple, that the public worldwide is fascinated about Greco-Roman civilization and how it's influenced the modern world. They want to read in an intelligent and accessible form about the joys of ancient languages, history, literature, philosophy, religion, art, and architecture. Contrary to the frequent claims that Greco-Roman antiquity lacks real public appeal unless it is rewritten and reframed in a more palatable or more contemporary form, the public are hungry to learn about such a remarkable and influential period of history and to face its difficult and even distasteful elements head on. They don't wish to be pandered to or patronized. It's therefore a profound privilege and thrill now to have the support and encouragement of the Pharos Foundation to support not just this lecture, but the whole Antigone project itself. Pharos shares our mission of not only upholding high standards in academia, but also helping satisfy the intellectual curiosity of the public at large. It's a truly exciting time to join forces in the fight. So, we are in sore need of a cultural renaissance, of an efflorescence of the inspirational. A life without the pleasures of literature, philosophy, music, and art is no life at all. At the start of this lecture, I worried about an age of 4 cultures. Without resistance, such a society will soon slide into one of no cultures. When C.P. Snow as Lewis Eliot in The Masters dismissed the victorious Master Crawford as a man who is shallow, with no feeling, no glow, and not a scrap of imagination, he could easily be describing the age that lies lifeless before us, unless, that is, we humans commit ourselves to revivifying and recovering the very discipline that bears our name. Thank you. I will close there.